Hi everyone, Aidan here from Herbert Miniatures. In today's video I'm going to show you my method of painting the Light of Eltharion from the Lumineth Realm Lord's Warhammer Age of Sigmar. This is a follow-on from my very first YouTube video in which I showed you how to build this model. If you've not seen that, the link is at the top right of the screen now, and in that video I walked through the methods used to ensure that the model is prepped and ready for painting. So once you know the techniques there, you're good to go for any modelling project that you may have in that regard. The colour scheme I've opted for is one that I had from my original 8th edition High Elves, as it is a scheme I wanted to update and play with a little, as I'd not touched them for nearly a decade. The general background for these High Elves back then is that they were an isolated band that lived in the mountains, with more of a focus on magic. You can see in the paint scheme from that time was not traditional, and in terms of first Warhammer Fantasy miniatures, there's a lot going on in terms of conversions and early freehand attempts. There is a lot from this colour scheme that I wanted to keep going forwards, such as the armour, the contrast between red, black and grey, but also I wanted to improve on general areas too, as time has progressed forward in my painting journey. Things like the gems I wanted to build up upon, and also for additions or conversions, I tend to add less rather than more, and in these you can tell they were early as they have lots going on. This Metal Cadrian model was a main warlord or general, and again more going on in terms of conversions and additions, such as green stuff for extended luscious hair, additional feathers on the helmet and halberd, and freehand at the bottom of the robes. It has seen some damage over time, unfortunately, due to house moves and on my part poor storage, but I may strip it and bring it into the Lumineth army going forward. I've not yet decided. With the High Elf Dragon Mage, this was originally painted the night before a painting competition in my local Games Workshop store, and surprisingly it won, so I was rather impressed with that. There are mistakes here and there, such as on the wing where the undercoat from the rattle can left a bit of an odd texture. I painted this back in 2011, so I think it was probably a damp day at the time. But as this was a fire mage, it didn't really bother me at all, it just added a bit of extra texture. I did do some minor conversions for the staff with a cracked gem in the centre, and I want to incorporate that somewhere on Eltharion, but I also want to add a new twist on it as well, still keeping with the mountain theme that the Lumineth are known for. For the base coat, I used a undercoat of Ushabti bone mixed with airbrush thinner. So, turning on my extractor booth. This was the first time on my part that I'd ever really broken out my airbrush and also the extractor booth to make sure I could breathe. So when I originally mixed the thinner and the paint together, it didn't come out in the right ratio, so I had to do a little bit of trial and error to figure that out properly, and the result I think was a lot better, but I definitely learned a great deal from it. In terms of an airbrush, it's a great tool to have, and I think it's one that I should use a lot more often, and the only way I'm going to get better with that, same with anything, is practice. So you can see on the cloak here that there's a little bit from my first attempt where it was a bit too watery, but following another coat, that pretty much eradicated that problem. So with the helmet in particular here, this will give a better demonstration of using the turntable and also how the coat went on in terms of the airbrush, making sure that it's a very thin and consistent coat, not too thick, not too heavy, and also not forgetting as well the brooch that went with it as well. So that one was a little bit easier to get the hang of. For the armour I used Citadel Contrast Skeleton Horde. Now as you can see here I'm slapping it on quite thick, as this was the first attempt I've ever had with contrast paints, but don't worry, this can be solved a little bit later and I'll show you how. So initially what I wanted to do is to get a bit of a feel for how the paints flow, how they work, and sometimes slapping it on the model works quite well, and with washes and glazes and things like that you always have the option of what I'm doing here, which is to pull away any excess that you get using the brush to wick up anything that you can but redistribute it elsewhere among the model. So in that respect, it was just a case of going over all of the armour pieces, wicking up excess where I could, and spreading it about the model for the armour panels of where I wanted them. So what I was looking for is a bit of a bone mould, like if you're a fan of Elder Scrolls or things like that. It's kind of the Morrowind-esque Dunmer armour that you find in Morrowind. Also need to make sure that you go over the brooch accordingly. In this essence, I wanted to keep the brooch the same kind of colour scheme as the armour. You have to do 1 or 2 coats just to cover the phoenix details, and also the base elements of the helmet as well. So taking your time in that regard, making sure you get all of the recesses and details that you want to be in that particular bone mould colour. So moving on to the fabrics, I started off with Citadel's Mephiston Red to provide a base coat to all of the fabrics that I wanted to be in this bright colour. So at the start, it was just picking out which details of fabric that I wanted to have as red. So in this instance, it was the loincloth and also the cloak as well. You don't have to be terribly neat. You might need probably 2 thin coats of this, just to ensure you get a good solid colour of Mephiston Red across the board. So this will act as our base layer, but make sure to keep this colour aside because it will come in handy a little bit later on. Once you've done that, you want to get a Citadel shade of Caribou Crimson, and this is to fill in the initial shadow details. So the important thing here is not to put the wash on too heavily, and to again make sure, similar to the contrast paint, that you pull away any excess and redistribute it among the model as much as possible. This is to eliminate staining as much as possible. So making sure that you don't get any parts of the model that have blotches or anything like that. Make sure as well to ensure that this wash is spread across the feathers of the helmet detail, and again making sure it's not blotchy. When it's dry, then you can reapply Mephiston Red to some of the raised detail areas to make them a bit more pronounced and stand out a little bit more. Following on from this, I took Evil Sunz Scarlet and began mixing that into Mephiston Red to begin a subtle gradient. So as you can see here, what I'm doing is I'm just painting on this colour with a small amount of Evil Sunz Scarlet onto the creases of the cape that are going to have the most prevalence in terms of catching the light. You don't have to go overboard with this. I mean, you don't have to be particularly neat either. Just follow the initial shadows that we did with the Caribou Crimson to differentiate between the 2 colours. And you can see already that it is quite bright, but as it dries it'll subtly change. And make sure to get the helmet as well to ensure that you make sure that those details of the feathers are more pronounced. What you can do then is keep on adding Evil Sunz Scarlet into the Mephiston Red, but this time, as you can see, I'm going in slightly more narrow. And this is to ensure that the colour that was beneath still shows up. What we're looking to do is, when you see gradients that are quite old school gradients, you see the bars of colour. We're trying to achieve that here, but for the smaller parts you won't necessarily see that. For the larger parts you will. When you get to larger bits, make sure to narrow in the gap of where this mixture of red paint is going to simulate the effect of brightness. So you can see already that this is having a pretty good effect as it is. Again, keeping in touch with the helmet, make sure to go over these details to make sure that they're pronounced as well and that they remain prominent. Finally, I added to that mixture of red that we already had some Wild Rider Red, which is the brightest highlight that we're going to apply. So following the same steps that we'd done previously is that we're aiming for a gradient. So what you want to do is you want to apply an initial part, but you want to narrow it each time you're brightening up that base mix. So every time you're adding Wild Rider Red, you are narrowing that gradient further and further inwards to get the brightest highlight possible that you can. Not really particularly neat in places, and you can see here that I go over some shadowy bits, but that's okay, it's not a problem. And you can see as well that I've changed the angle of my brush for where the direction of light is likely to be at the edge of the cloak. So with respect to the loincloth, that one was a bit more tricky, so I neglected to film parts of that, but you can see why, is that for the prominent bits of light, it's very tricky to get that right. Finally, we're applying some very, very fine highlights of this mixture to the very edges of the feathers to keep their prominence and to make sure that the helmet doesn't lose any impact later on down the line. Using a red glaze from Citadel, I elected then to put this all over the fabrics that I'd already painted, and this will emphasize the gradient that we're looking for. So what this will do is allow all of the colors that we've put together to provide a much more subtle transition between them all and to effectively blur the lines of where those gradients are. So you can see underneath the cloak I'd also applied some gradients there as well. So I'm applying this glaze all over the red fabrics that I've painted, and again this is just to ensure that all of the gradients from the darkest to the lightest parts of the fabric all blend together accordingly and are done properly. So again, don't have to be terribly neat at this stage, you just make sure that this glaze goes all over the red fabrics as much as possible. And again, sorry to be a nag in this regard, not missing out the helmet as well, so we want to make sure that those reds are blended together as well. Now to move on to the blacks of the fabric, so what I decided to do here is to paint the sword sheath, and also I wanted to ensure that the gems were painted in an undercoat of black as well. You can see here that I'm being quite neat to try and get all of the crevices as much as I can, and also the straps on the back of the helmet and around the armour I wanted to be sure were in a black colour as well. Moving on to the swords, I started off with a base coat of Citadel's Lead Belcher, so ultimately what I've got is a thinned down coat of Lead Belcher, and on the long sword I'm making sure that this is applied all over. There are going to be some additional effects added afterwards, but this doesn't matter at this stage. We just want to get the base coat on the long and short sword. Moving on to the armour, I started off with Balthazar Gold and then applied that to all of the chainmail aspects of the armour. So in that regard, again, being quite neat, I made sure that I had a very thin, even coat, picked out the details around the helmet and the armour trim. So on the bone mould carapace that we have, it's a case of picking out that detail as carefully as possible to make sure that we've got all of that nice base coat ready. For the tassels of the cloak, I wanted to use Nagaroth Night to provide a bluey purple base coat, so here what I'm doing is applying that as carefully as possible. What I didn't want to do is to undo the work that's already been done with respect to the gradients of the cloak. And again, going back to the brooch, make sure that that tassel is covered as well. So following that, I did a glaze of a Guilliman blue, and this is to emphasize more of the blue colors that are associated. So I wanted to have a nice contrast between the reds and the blues accordingly. I also elected at this stage to apply whites into the center of the gems, which I wanted to later paint in a yellow scheme. So this is to emphasize the whole Lumineth concept of being a light and shining aspect of the Lumineth Realm Lords. So what I'm doing here is applying a watered down white into the recesses of each blade, and what that will allow is a base coat for object source lighting aspects that we're going to apply later. Moving back to the armour and using Gehenna's Gold, I went over all of the base coated armours and wanted to brighten them up much more. So this is the first layer of that colour to brighten up those golds and to make them really pop a bit more from the bone mould armour. And you can see that I'm also applying this to the swords as well, very, very carefully before we go ahead and apply any of the object source lighting effects that we have planned shortly. So this can be a little bit tricky, so make sure you don't have too much on the brush, and also make sure that you're catching the details that you need to catch. In respects to the sword sheath, it's a case of making sure that some of that base colour shows, but blending it accordingly with the highlight colour that we've chosen. Following an undercoat of black for the gem on the shoulder, I decided to then mix up a ratio of Screamer Pink and then boost that with Pink Horror to achieve a more subtle gradient, and to finalise everything to blend it all together used a shade of Caribou Crimson. Going back to the armour for a third and final time using Auric Armour Gold, I then boosted the gold even further to make it super shiny. So in this respect, all we're picking out is just the edges of the bone mould armour, the helmet, and we're also applying this to the swords. Speaking of the swords, we're applying Runefang Steel to the edges of the swords in a sort of sideways swiping motion. What this allowed is a little bit of edge highlighting, but in a slightly different way. So we're applying a little bit of texture to the sword blade to simulate forged steel in a more accurate manner. With Lamanta's yellow, we're now moving on to something I really enjoy doing, which is object source lighting. So with the white undercoat areas that we've applied earlier, all we have to do is apply a very watered down mix of this Lamanta's yellow to simulate where the glow is coming from. Now remember, with this technique, less is indeed more. Finally, for our very last step, we're applying Seraphim Sepia all over the golds and the bone mould armour, and this is ultimately to provide as much of a tie-in together to make it all look like it was forged as one piece rather than individual pieces. So you can see here on the chainmail, this is applying a bit more of a richer hue, especially as we've already got yellows in the form of object source lighting. So where the Skeleton Horde contrast paint missed, this technique allows for all of those shaded recesses to pop out a bit more and to provide a bit more of a contrast against the gold. Moving on to basing, what I'm doing now is applying PVA glue to all of the sections of the base that I want to apply modelling sand to. So there's some general texture that's applied to the base already, but I want to cover that up as much as I can to get a decent blend as much as I can between the base and the model itself. So once I'd applied all my PVA glue, I submerged the model into the modelling sand that I had and left it to dry. Following that, what I did is applied some little dots onto the columns that Eltharion is standing on, and what this allowed was for myself to apply some extra detail in the form of some stray bits of sand to simulate that it's been submerged for some level of time. So here what I'm doing from a height is applying some sprinkles of sand, and after it dried I thought it came out quite well, so just have to brush off some of the excess that's gotten to the edges of the base and we can move on. For painting the sand, I started off with Abaddon Black as a base coat, and as you can see here, it's a very watered down mix. This is to allow for a capillary action when you're painting onto the sand, so the sand itself will absorb all of the moisture from the water and the pigment of the paint together in one step. This allows for a bit more of an even coverage, especially when it comes to sand. For the actual columns themselves, you don't have to use a watered down mix, but it can't hurt in that respect. It just might take about 2 or 3 coats to get the desired coverage that you want. So if you wanted to, you could add a bit more of your black into the watered down mix that you've got already, and then apply that to the columns as you see fit. When the paint was dry, with Eshian Grey, what I then did is again applied a fairly watered down mix onto the sand to provide an initial base coat for what I wanted for the overall look of a mountain-esque kind of base that I'd envisioned. Once that had dried, I applied a coat of Nuln oil across all of the columns and the sand to bring them all together and to offer a little bit more of depth of colour to the columns and to the sand itself. Once that was done, I then applied a dry brush of Dawnstone, which then brought out all of the initial highlights that I wanted to have for the initial sort of dustiness associated with stone that has fallen over itself and clobbered together wherever possible. So that worked out pretty well, I thought, and it's just a case of making sure that you've applied as much or as little as you want in terms of highlight for the columns in particular. And once we came to the end of it, it was looking pretty good. So I went ahead and also applied some gem effects to the columns as well, and also went back to do some highlights on the blacks, but it's just a little bit of an edge highlight with some very, very light grey. Rummaging my bits and pieces box, I managed to find two very old Citadel basing kits. So one was Mordheim Tufts and the other was various basing components in relation to slate and stone, which I thought would be really, really suitable for this particular miniature. So breaking them out, managed to find some big pieces of stone that matched the paintwork, which was excellent, and some very little chipped pieces as well. So both together would be pretty advantageous, I thought, for this build. So what I'm doing here is snipping away some of the initial painted bits that I did, and that's okay. Initially what I thought was, it'd be nice to have some painted bits here and there for the grass effects, but with the Mordheim Tufts and for the slated bits of stone that I've got, I thought it would be better to replace them with that. So here's the end result so far of my butchery. And don't worry about this for the moment, this will be covered up a bit later with the slate. So got myself a little bit of a pile of the big ones, and I'm using a small pair of modelling tweezers to apply them where I needed them. So just using these tweezers to apply the bigger pieces of slate wherever possible, and using Loctite glue to secure them in place as needed. Now with my smaller pile of slate put aside, what I've done is to apply PVA glue around some of the more bulky bits of slate and stone that I've put in place. So this will add a little bit more extra security to those stones that have been put in place, and allow a nice adhesion base for the bits of slate that we have. So in the little groove bit here, what I wanted to do is apply as much small bits of slate as possible to simulate much more of the rubble associated with the crumbled pillars. So again, going around some of the other aspects, applying as much as I could for the slate to adhere to. So here I am shoving it on as much as possible and trying to keep it as fairly loose as I can. But you will need to pat it down a little bit just to keep it in place, and brush whatever excess bits you can to adhere it wherever possible. Final step in that respect is to apply some Army Painter varnish to the entire model, and once we've done that is to apply some Ard Coat to the gems. And there we are. It's taken an age to get there, but there is the fully painted Light of Eltharion in a similar colour scheme that I had nearly a decade ago. So I like the improvements that I've made to it in terms of the gradients on the cape. The gems have definitely been a highlight, and the use of object source lighting as well. So in comparison to where I was to where I am now, it's definitely a step up. I was really pleased to find the bits of stone and slate that matched up perfectly with the painted colour that I had for the base, and I will be using that going forward for the remainder of the Lumineth Realm Lord's army. It'll be a nice thing to apply overall to tie them all in together. So thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate you sticking around. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing, and please leave a like and a comment with respects to your thoughts on the video. Thank you all so much for watching. Take care for now.